Welcome to Stay Close. I'm your host, Sarah Brassard. I'm so glad to be back with you, sharing these early stories of my life and learning more and more about this journey of self-discovery that I've been on for quite a while, but continue to find amazing routes and paths to deeper learning, which I'm super grateful for. It's become a powerful step in my growth, this podcast, because it's expanding me beyond my comfort zone, which is a big thing for me because I've been really partial to staying close to my comfort zone for understandable reasons. But now I am pushing the borders and it feels great. Just a heads up on where I am right now. I'm sure you can probably tell my voice is more nasally. This will tie into our story today. I was intentional about getting on today and actually doing something that I normally wouldn't do, which is not record while I was at the tail end of an infection or upper respiratory infection. But I felt it really tied into what we were going to discuss. So bear with me through the pauses that I have to take and the nasally sound of my voice. I am showing up vulnerable today, people, and I think that ties in beautifully to what we're discussing here today. In the first episode, I spoke about losing my parents when I was 13 and then 16. And I also talked to you about what I'm calling the sort of physical initiation into a whole new way of looking at my life. And that was through the lesson at age 32 of having bronchial pneumonia that put me in bed for 2 weeks. I love to call it an initiation because it was such a profound time for me. It was a time where I was in bed. I was forced into stillness. And that can be pretty scary, right? When you are in full gear, when you are actively doing, and pushing yourself forward and possibly not addressing the things that are calling for healing. It is one of the tools we use, right? We do get busy when we don't want to look at our tender parts. And it's hard to hear those tender parts when we're moving fast. So that surely was the case for me. And what that 2 weeks did for me was help me take the hard right turn of my life. It was a seismic event that challenged me to look at everything I was doing and reassess it. And to ask the questions like, how do you like what you're creating? How do you like what you're bringing to your day-to-day? How happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10? All these things that I'm not sure I would have asked at that time in my life, but I did. And it supported my journey. It was step 1 on what has almost been a 35-year journey toward healing and self-discovery. So interestingly, after I recorded that last episode, I began feeling similar symptoms returning, like heaviness in my chest, things I hadn't experienced in 33 years. I have not had an upper respiratory infection, thank God, in 33 years. But what happened was it started to come on, and I went ahead and did all the things that I usually do to take care of myself as I feel something come in. Well, nothing worked. This was coming through. This was like a freight train that was coming in with a purpose to address something that needed to be addressed in my life. And it was not going to let go of me until I spent time with it. This became very clear to me in the beginning. I knew that something was happening. I knew that it was more than a physical response. And very soon after the symptoms began, I understood that I would have to devote time to this in a way that I was not used to devoting time to myself. And that's been the case with this infection because I've been dealing with this now almost 3 weeks. I could feel myself in this process, right? I could feel myself wanting to get on with it, wanting to be done with it. And every time I thought, okay, now we're done with this healing, I wasn't. And it kept progressing and progressing to the point of like taking me to urgent care because I couldn't breathe. So, of course, when you can't breathe, things like this happen. It's very scary, isn't it? It's very scary. But the thing that was so profound for me is that while, yeah, I mean, I was cautious and of course I was considering everything, but I wasn't scared. I wasn't scared. I was able to hold the understanding that I was being taken care of. My husband was by my side. I had been in touch with my doctors. And in this case, when I decided to go to urgent care, it was like, yeah, now you need to go to urgent care because your breathing has become more labored and this is not right. So I started to really be able to ask myself as I like cleared the calendar and just hunkered down in this place of, okay, this is where I'm supposed to be right now. I had to ask, what is trying to be expressed? What needs healing? And when I asked that, I journaled on this whole experience that said, oh my God, this is old grief coming through my physical body right now. Old sadness coming up to be seen, heard, held, and released. And during these 2 weeks, something profound has happened. I felt things open. I felt restrictions and obstacles really let go. I've allowed myself to be vulnerable in a way that I don't truly know if I've ever let myself be vulnerable. And in this place of taking exceptional care of myself and listening deeply to these whispers of what I call my spirit and taking action by canceling my calendar, something I never do, I was able to prioritize me. This was the warmest, most luxurious blanket I could possibly wrap around myself. That understanding that I am prioritizing me. And even though it wasn't easy, the whisper, that spirit whisper, kept coming through. We'll figure it out. Let's be here right now. Let's trust the unknown has the answers and that you don't have to have those answers right now. So this practice of divine order, that I went on a public platform and started talking about a piece of my life about 32 years ago based on some physical ailment that I had had, and that very ailment dropped into my life later that day, 2 or 3 hours after I actually recorded that audio. I had that very same ailment come through me. It's not lost on me. It will never be lost on me. And it guided me to understandings about what was going on in my life that felt so extraordinarily right. Yeah. Now let's also bring back the title of this podcast and my learning around that quote from David White's Courage. I am courageous as I move closer to the way I was made. So there it is. There is this intention, this sankalpa, as we call it in Yoga Nidra, that was like a seed in some very fertile ground of my learning that this is the direction I want to move in. I want to move closer to the way I was made. And so just by asking that means I was asking for source, for the universe, for God, for ancestors, for whatever it is to support me in clearing obstacles and healing grief that had been stored in my body. Grief, truly, I didn't know existed. Think about it at an energetic level. I'm an energetic healer, so I'm always referencing energy to the body. And at an energetic level, heart and lungs are where the emotions live. This grief, it emerged through my upper respiratory infection. The original wound, losing my mom at 13 and my dad at 16. It was initiation into a completely new way of living 32 years ago. And now this very same respiratory infection, very similar in characteristics as far as not being able to breathe, very heavy on my chest, all through my head, and all of what I felt substantiated this tremendous grief that I felt all those years ago when my parents left. So I find myself reflecting on things that I truthfully haven't reflected on in years and years. And it made me wonder, what happens in our brains when we finally acknowledge stored emotions? What changes when we rewrite the narrative we've been telling ourselves for all these years? Well, in my years of learning, I've discovered something really fascinating. Neuroscientists call it neuroplasticity, when our brains have this remarkable ability to reorganize themselves by forming new neural connections. So when we rewrite our stories, we're literally rewiring our brains. Think about it. Each time we tell ourselves, this happened to me, we strengthen one neural pathway. But when we shift to this happened for me, we create an entirely new pathway. Isn't that amazing? And over time, the old pathway weakens and the new one grows stronger. So yeah, I'm a spiritual person, but this just isn't spiritual talk or wishful thinking. It's science. Studies literally have shown that cognitive reframing techniques physically change blood flow patterns in the brain. They reduce activity in the amygdala, the fear center, that place where it all happens, and increase activity in our prefrontal cortex, the reasoning center. So this is like physiologically changing the way we interact with our lives. I know in my own life how this plays out is when I'm actively in practice in changing a behavior or habit, and there is a level of consistency to that learning, that what I discover is it's like I'm looking at my life in the rearview mirror. I literally would have reacted completely differently than the way I just reacted. It's almost like it's just not the priority for me anymore. That reaction is not what comes up first. Instead, the reasoning center is kicking in, giving me a pause, and allowing me to decide on a completely different way of responding to this situation that I've responded to for so long in the same way. Now is different. So I think this is a really good opportunity to give you a little practice that may give you your own experience of what it might be like to change a habit that has been hanging on. And because our behaviors and our life are triggered by experiences that we have had and possibly not resolved through, I would invite you to join me in this short little practice. But of course, everything is an invitation. And if this doesn't feel right to you, please honor that. So we're going to go with something called the story shift. So I'd just like you to take a moment to think about a challenging experience from your past. And when you bring that in, bring it in with some breath. A nice deep inhale through the nose and expand that belly. And then notice how your body feels as you recall this challenging experience. What is your body feeling? Is there tightness, heaviness? Where do you feel it? And then ask yourself, what if this experience wasn't happening to me, but was happening for me? So those are two very important words, not happening to you, but happening for you. And what gifts might it have brought for you? What strengths did you develop when it was happening for you? And how did it prepare you for something important later? So I'm just going to say those questions again, and you can just put them in your journal or just store them somewhere. But they're very important prompts when you're doing this personal kind of work. So what if the experience wasn't happening to me, but for me? What gifts might it have brought to me? What strengths did it develop in me? And how did it prepare me for something important later? And the piece about the body here is so important. Let's not forget that the body is our truth teller, right? So feel the subtle shifts in your body as you consider these questions. And then realize that this shifts your brain in creating new neural pathways just by asking those questions. I just think that's amazing. I'm just so fascinated that a simple inquiry like that can take us to such a profound place of healing. So I did try this on my own experience of losing my parents. It brought back the story, right? The abandonment, the loss. But when I began to reframe it as a journey that gave me resilience and deep empathy for others experiencing grief, something changed. Now, the grief didn't disappear. That's not the goal. But it transformed something that controlled me to something that informed me. And neurologically, that's profound. Recently, I read something by Dr. Maya Reinhardt, a neuroscientist specializing in trauma and narrative therapy. She explained in this article that when we experience trauma, our brain can get stuck in a protection mode. I surely do get that. Constantly scanning for threats. I call it hypervigilance. But when we consciously rewrite our narrative, we help our nervous system understand that we're safe now. This is not when I was 13 anymore. This no longer applies to my life, this trauma. That seems amazing. She shared that when somebody reframes their story, we can actually see changes in their vagal tone. Here's what she shared. When someone reframes their story, we can actually see changes in their vagal tone, a measure of how well their parasympathetic nervous system is functioning. Their heart rate variability improves, their immune function strengthens, and their stress hormones decrease. It's as if the body finally receives the message that danger has passed. Wow. I totally align with this, not just because these words make sense to me, But because I can substantiate these words through my own experience, it literally ties in directly to what I experienced during my recent illness. Because I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to prioritize my needs, to listen to what my body was telling me. And what I didn't actually realize until I read this article was that I was literally rewiring my brain's response to grief. Wow. Big deep breath on that one for me. Really amazing. So what does this mean for you? It means that every time you choose to see your challenges as initiations rather than obstacles, you're changing your brain chemistry. And every time you practice vulnerability instead of armoring up, you're strengthening neural pathways that support your healing. So I invite you to try something new this week. Choose one story you tell about yourself. Perhaps something you've labeled as a failure or a disappointment. Write it down exactly as you currently tell it. Then write a second version that focuses on what you gained, what you learned, and how you grew. I invite you to read both of those versions out loud. And in doing so, notice how your body responds to each version. That visceral response is your nervous system speaking to you. And the more we can do this, the more we can interact with the body. So the mind and the body are best friends rather than getting stuck in the body or getting stuck in the mind. We have asked these two extraordinary elements of our life to collaborate. So as I continue to heal from this respiratory infection, this what I'm calling my second initiation, I am deeply grateful for this reminder that our bodies hold wisdom our conscious minds often miss. I'm grateful to rewrite not just my present story, but to go back and reframe stories from decades ago. This is the courage that poet David Whyte speaks of. The courage to move closer to that way we were made. It's not always comfortable. Truthfully, it rarely is. But it's always worth it. I'm rewriting that narrative. And in this podcast is my open journal. It's kind of like clearing the attic and finding forgotten treasures, except way less dusty and more emotionally fulfilling. My healing journey has been about rewriting that story in a way that feels safe, allowing me to move through fears, doubts, and anger that have been stuck in me for far too long. Telling my story through this podcast is part of that healing. I'm going deeper into experiences I've never fully explored before, ready now to heal the original wound. We connect vibrationally with others when we speak from our hearts rather than from our heads. This podcast is about dropping in, sitting with you, seeing you in your original wound with compassion, not judgment. We're kindred spirits on this learning path. And when we find voices that resonate, we gain hope and don't feel so alone. So thank you for holding space for me today as I shared this tender story that has come up to be healed. A story that's part of my healing and hopefully inspires you to listen to a tender story inside you. Listen, we must share our stories because in sharing, we experience the medicine of that tale. Until next week, I thank you for being here. Stay close.
Feet, the sensual toe tapping up your street.
This is Sarah Brassard, and you've been listening to Stay Close. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear this message. Stay close, everyone.